They mocked me as an old soldier's, but an old soldier knows how to wait, how to strike, and how to win. It was November 1st, 2022, Austin, Texas. The air carried that strange mix of crisp fall leaves and barbecue smoke drifting from neighbors' yards. I had just come home from the grocery store with nothing but eggs, bread, and coffee. A simple life, I never needed more. But sitting on the kitchen counter, half buried under yesterday's mail, was a crumpled receipt that didn't belong to me. The numbers hit me like shrapnel. $2,846.19. Luxury spa services, champagne valet parking at the Four Seasons. I unfolded the paper with my calloused hands, hands that had signed deployment orders, held rifles, and saluted folded flags. But this paper cut deeper than anything I'd carried before. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I turned the receipt over, half hoping it was a mistake. But there it was, Linda's name written in delicate cursive at the top. My wife. My partner. The woman who once told me she loved my modesty, my quiet discipline, the way I didn't flash money like her friends' husbands. The front door creaked, and she walked in. Perfect timing, if there is such a thing. Linda tossed her handbag onto the chair and caught me holding the bill. "You're home early," she said, her tone flat, almost annoyed. I held up the receipt. "What sep's this?" She didn't even flinch. She smirked, eyes sharp like broken glass. "It sep's what a woman deserves after wasting her prime years with an old soldier." The word old landed harder than any bullet. "All these years," she continued, pulling off her scarf. "And what do I get? A pension check that barely covers groceries, a rusty truck in the driveway, and a man too proud to admit he's finished. Do you know what the neighbors say, Coulter? They call you the relic. A war relic who never moved on." She let out a small laugh, cruel and cold. I could have married someone who built a life. Instead, I married discipline and silence. I felt the silence between us stretch. She wanted me to lash out, to argue, but discipline is the only inheritance the army left me. I folded the receipt once, twice, slid it into my shirt pocket, and said nothing. But inside I was bleeding. Later that night, the bleeding turned to fire. I was in the garage pretending to work on the old Chevy when the house phone rang. Linda's laugh carried through the open window. I heard a man's voice. Rick Wallace, her brother, my so-called brother-in-law. I froze, every muscle tense, ears straining. "Don't said worry, sis," Rick chuckled, his voice greasy with arrogance. "We said bleed him dry. The old man once said know what hit him. By Christmas that house is yours. And we said he'll have his name buried under invoices." I gripped the wrench in my hand so tight the metal bit into my palm. For a second I wanted to storm in, confront them both. But then I remembered the words drilled into me at Fort Benning, 1989, "Patience wins battles, the bullet never could." I forced myself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I set the wrench down carefully, wiped the grease on my jeans, and stared at the folded flag on the garage shelf. My father's flag. My reminder that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. Rixit's voice carried again. Lower this time, almost a whisper. "Just keep mocking him, sis. Make him feel irrelevant." He said he'll fold. Irrelevant. That was the second time that word had been used on me in a single day. First by my wife, now by her co-conspirator. I went back into the house later, calm as ever. Linda sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, glass of wine half full. She didn't even look up. "Don't wait up," she said casually. "I've got errands tomorrow." I nodded, kissed my daughter Emily good night. She was already curled up with her books, oblivious to the war brewing under our roof, and slipped quietly into bed. But sleep never came. My mind played back every detail, the numbers on the receipt, Rick's words, Linda's smirk. I cataloged them the way I used to map enemy positions in Kabul. Every word was a coordinate. Every lie, a weakness. That night, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just betrayed, I was underestimated. They thought I was broke. They thought I was finished. They thought discipline was the same as defeat. By the time the first November frost hit the windows, I had already decided I wasn't going to confront Linda or Rick. Not yet. I would do what soldiers are trained to do: gather intel, build a case, and strike only when victory was certain. So I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to Linda sit, steady breathing beside me, and I whispered, not to her, not even to myself, but to the ghost of every battle I set fought. You think I've said 'em irrelevant, you said will learn I've said 'em inevitable. The garage was quiet that November evening, but inside me there was a war raging louder than artillery fire. I sat on the old wooden stool, staring at the folded flag that had once draped my father's coffin. Its edges were frayed, but it still held the weight of honor. Linda's words echoed through the silence like Ricochet's old soldier, relic, irrelevant. I had faced insurgents who wanted me dead, commanders who doubted me, and nights when the desert cold cut straight to my bones. None of that compared to hearing my wife sneer at me like I was some expired ration left behind on the battlefield. I reached for a rag and wiped grease from my hands. But the stain of betrayal stayed. It was in my chest, in my veins. The next morning, November 2nd, Linda played her part well. She wore her silk robe, humming as if nothing had happened. But when she thought I wasn't looking, I caught the smirk still lingering on her face. The same smirk she wore when she mocked me. Neighbors had started whispering too. Austin's streets were tight-knit. People talked at the grocery store. Mrs. Carmichael leaned in and said, I heard Linda's been living the high life lately. Must be nice to have a husband so generous. Her tone was innocent, but the dagger was hidden inside. I smiled, nodded, but inside I thought, so she wants me to be the fool in everyone's story. That night, as I pulled into the driveway, I caught Linda on the porch with Rick. His voice carried across the yard, loud and confident. Don't stat worry, sis. Everyone sees him as broke and washed up. By the time we start done, he said have nothing left. Linda laughed, a sharp, cruel laugh that cut deeper than knives. And that's when I realized for the first time since combat I felt stripped of honor, not by an enemy in uniform but by the woman who vowed to stand beside me. I walked past them without a word, carrying the weight of silence like a rucksack. I poured myself a coffee, black, bitter. In the reflection of the kitchen window, I could still see their silhouettes outside, plotting against me. Later that evening, Emily padded softly into the garage. My daughter had her mother's eyes, but not her mother's heart. She looked at me, studying my face, sensing the storm. Dad, she whispered, are you okay? I forced a smile, patting her shoulder. Of course, old soldiers don't break that easy. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and went back upstairs. That was Emily, loyal, watchful, wiser than her 19 years. She didn't press, but I knew she noticed more than she let on. When the house grew quiet, I sat alone, sipping lukewarm coffee. My mind replayed every laugh, every insult, every whisper of betrayal. They thought humiliation would wear me down, make me surrender. But they didn't understand soldiers. You can strip us of comfort, you can strip us of praise, but you can't strip us of patience. On November 3rd, I drove to the VA office to pick up my pension slip. As I stood in line, listening to the shuffling of papers and the quiet coughs of other veterans, I felt that word irrelevant pressing against my ribs like a blade. I tucked the slip carefully into my folder, right beside the folded receipt for $2,846. Evidence, proof, ammunition. When I got home that evening, Linda was already dressed for dinner out, a black dress, pearls, her perfume heavy in the air. She didn't even glance at me as she said, try not to wait up. I wanted to ask her if the pearls came from that same bill I found, if the laughter with Rick was louder than the vows we once spoke. But I kept my mouth shut. Soldiers don't waste ammo on warning shots. The house was quiet that night, except for the sound of my own thoughts. I pulled out my father's old service knife from the wooden chest. I didn't unsheath it. I didn't need to. I just held it, cold and solid, reminding me that strength isn't always in striking. Sometimes it's in waiting. By November 4th, the whispers had grown. At church, a man I barely knew clapped me on the shoulder and said, Coulter, you should treat your wife to something nice now and then. She deserves it. I smiled politely, but inside, rage and shame tangled like barbed wire. Linda's performance was working. The world saw me as the miser, the relic, the old soldier who couldn't keep up with life. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know the accounts, the trusts, the millions quietly compounding while Linda played house with lies. And I decided right then, let them laugh. Let them mock. Laughter is loud, but truth is heavier. That night, in the stillness of the garage, I whispered into the shadows. You can strip me of honor in front of neighbors, you can laugh at me in the open, but a soldier doesn't need applause to fight. I don't need your validation. I need only one thing, patience. I folded the VA slip and tucked it into the same drawer as the crumpled bill, side by side. Two pieces of paper, harmless on their own, but together they were a seed. A beginning, and just like on any battlefield, beginnings matter. November 3rd arrived with a sky the color of ash. The kind of day where the Texas sun hides behind clouds, leaving everything in a dull gray. I woke early, still carrying the sting of Linda's laughter from the night before. Every word of hers was a splinter under my skin. Relic, irrelevant, old soldier. I tried to lose myself in routine. Eggs sizzling in the pan, the scrape of a butter knife on toast. But the silence in the house felt heavier than the gear I used to carry on deployments. Linda had already left. Her perfume lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the scent of coffee. She didn't kiss me goodbye anymore, hadn't in months. As I sat at the table, my daughter Emily came down the stairs. Hair pulled back, a stack of textbooks in her arms. 19 years old, quiet, deliberate, more like me than she ever realized. She glanced at me, then at the empty seat across from me where Linda should have been. "Morning, Dad," she said softly. "Morning, sweetheart." She poured herself a glass of orange juice, sat down, and studied me for a moment. I tried to hide the storm behind my eyes, but Emily had always been sharper than people gave her credit for. Later that afternoon, as I sorted laundry, another small act of routine to keep my hands busy and my mind steady, Emily came into the room. She held out a small slip of paper between her fingers, her face pale but determined. "I found this in Mom's coat pocket," she whispered. I took it carefully. A hotel receipt, dated November 3rd, 2022. The Marriott downtown, charges for dinner for two. A room suite, champagne service. My chest tightened. The amount $642.57. I looked at my daughter. "Emily," she shook her head quickly. "Dad, I trust you. I know what this means." Those 5 words, "I trust you," carried more weight than all the medals I'd ever been pinned with. In that moment, my daughter became more than my child. She became my ally. I slipped the receipt into the same drawer where the crumpled Four Seasons bill and VA slip waited. 3 slips of paper, 3 threads of truth, slowly weaving into a net strong enough to catch lies. That night, when Linda came home, I didn't confront her. She strutted through the door, humming, pretending nothing was wrong. I played my part too, quiet, steady. The old soldier she thought had no fight left. But after she disappeared into the shower, I pulled out my phone and dialed Mason Clark. Mason wasn't just my lawyer. He was a brother in arms, a man I'd served with during my last deployment. Back then he was sharp, tactical, the kind of officer who could read a battlefield in seconds. After the army, he studied law and built a reputation as precise as his marksmanship. When he picked up, his voice was low but firm. "Coulter, I was waiting for this call." I slid the receipts across my workbench, as if Mason could see them through the line. "I've got proof, Mason. A crumpled $2,800 bill from the Four Seasons. A VA pension slip. And now a $642 Marriott receipt. All in her name." He exhaled slowly. "And Rick?" I overheard him, November 1st. He said they bleed me dry. That by Christmas the house would be hers. Mason Summer's voice hardened, carrying the edge. I remembered from patrols overseas. "They don't know you. Already set the flank. We was still let them think they winning. You was store not cornered, Coulter. You store waiting for the right moment to strike." The word flank stirred something inside me. Strategy, patience, position. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was a battle plan. "File everything," I said quietly. Every receipt, every word, every forged invoice they try to shove in front of the judge. I said I'll hand you the ammo, you do the firing. Mason chuckled darkly. Roger that. I self prep the filings. We wait until they dug themselves into the trench, then we bury them. After the call, I sat in the garage, staring at the flag, the receipts, the knife. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel broken. I felt focused. The next few days passed with calculated silence. I watched Linda laugh louder, smile wider, parade herself around the neighborhood. She thought she was winning. She thought I was too proud, too weak to see what was happening. But on November 6th, Emily slipped into the garage again. She sat beside me, her hand on my arm. Dad, I don't care what Mom says about you, she whispered. I know who you are. I swallowed hard, throat tight. Soldiers are trained to control emotion, but her words pierced deeper than shrapnel. I placed my hand over hers. Emily, someday you'll understand why silence matters, why patience matters. But I promise you this, I won't set to let her lies destroy what we set built. Not you, not me, not this house. She nodded, eyes shining. Then I said I'll help you. Whatever you need. And with that, my daughter became my silent gift of truth. By November 7th, the file was growing. Each paper tucked neatly in its place. Each date, each amount logged like coordinates on a battlefield map. I didn't know how long the campaign would take, but I knew one thing, the war wasn't being fought in whispers anymore. It was being fought in evidence. And evidence doesn't lie. November 8th, 2022. A Tuesday morning, cool air biting through my jacket as I returned from the hardware store. I carried nothing but motor oil and sandpaper, small comforts for a soldier who found peace in fixing old engines. But when I reached the front door, my key didn't turn. I jiggled it once, twice, nothing. The lock had been changed. For a moment, I stood there in silence, the bag of motor oil heavy in my hand. A neighbor across the street paused mid-rake, watching me with quiet curiosity, and in that frozen second, I understood what Linda had done. She hadn't just changed the lock on a house. She'd tried to change the lock on my life. I set the bag down gently on the porch, pulled out my phone, and dialed the locksmith. Yes, this is Coulter Hayes, I said, keeping my voice calm. I need a copy of the new lock receipt you just installed. Address 432 Willow Bend. There was hesitation on the line. Then the man cleared his throat. Yes, sir, that was this morning. Mrs. Hayes requested it. I can email you the copy. Down-dusted email, I said firmly. Print it. I shall pick it up myself. By noon I had the paper in hand, $128.76, dated November 8th, 2022, Linda's signature scrawled at the bottom. Another piece of evidence, another nail for the coffin she was building for herself. I tucked the receipt into my folder alongside the Four Seasons bill, the Marriott slip, and my VA pension record. 4 sheets of paper now, layered like sandbags around a foxhole. That evening, as I walked into the kitchen, Linda stood at the counter, slicing lemons with theatrical precision. She didn't even look at me when she said, "Oh, did you have trouble with the locks? I thought it was time for an upgrade. You can never be too safe." Her words dripped with mockery. She wanted me to explode, to rage, to prove her story of the angry, washed-up veteran. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket, touched the folded locksmith receipt, and said nothing. The silence unnerved her more than any outburst could have. She slammed the knife down on the cutting board, turning to face me. Coulter, don't give me that look. I'm tired of living like we're broke. I'm tired of being invisible. Once you're out of the picture, maybe I'll finally have the life I deserve. Invisible, that word stung almost as much as irrelevant. I glanced past her into the dining room, where boxes of new curtains and furniture samples sat stacked against the wall. Rick Sepp's voice rang out from the living room, casual and smug. Don't nespert worry, sis. Once the old soldier Sepp's gone, we Sepp'll make this place shine. He walked in with a tape measure in hand, stretching it across the windows. He didn't even acknowledge me. To them, I was already gone. Erased, forgotten, locked out not just of the house, but of their future plans. Linda laughed, a brittle, arrogant laugh. Imagine it, Rick. Thanksgiving in this house without the relics sitting at the table. Finally, we shall have something to show off. Rick smirked, snapping the tape measure shut. All it takes is paperwork. We just got the invoices. The judge one set think twice. I stood in the doorway, quiet as ever, every detail searing into my memory. The curtains measured, the words spoken, the tone of their laughter. Soldiers don't just hear words, they catalog them. Every sound becomes intelligence. Emily walked in at that moment, carrying her school bag. She froze when she saw Rick in the living room, Linda smiling too brightly at his side. She looked at me, her eyes filled with questions. But I shook my head slightly. Not yet. She lowered her gaze, clutching her bag tighter, and slipped upstairs. I sat at the table later, staring at the worn wood grain, the scratches from years of family dinners. Linda leaned against the counter, swirling wine in her glass, mocking me with her silence. I thought about my fellow soldiers, the ones who never came home, the ones who fought for families they'd never see again. And here I was, betrayed in the very home I'd bled to protect. But soldiers know something. Civilians forget. Every lock can be picked, every plan countered, every ambush reversed. That night I called Mason again. They changed the locks, I said simply. Good, Mason replied without hesitation. That SIP's not just betrayal, Coulter. That SIP's intimidation. Courts take that seriously. You kept the receipt? Yes, signed by her. Then we SIF got them. Let them laugh. Let them measure curtains. They sifter digging their own trench, and they don't set even see the artillery we sifter lining up. His words steadied me. For every insult, for every lock, I had paper, and paper in a courtroom is heavier than steel. The days that followed, Linda grew bolder. She hosted little gatherings in the house, parading Rick around like he belonged there. Neighbors came in, sipping wine, admiring the upgrades she bragged about. They whispered, they chuckled, they pitied me in silence. I didn't fight it. I stayed in the garage, oil-stained hands busy with engines, ears tuned to every word drifting through the walls. Soldiers don't chase respect. They earn it in silence, waiting for the moment to strike. On November 10th, I watched from the garage window as Rick loaded more samples into the trunk of his truck. He kissed Linda on the cheek, too familiar for a brother-in-law, and said loudly, "This place will be ours by Christmas." He said I'll be out on the street. Linda laughed again, tossing her hair. Out with the old, in with the new. Her laughter cut deeper than knives, but I didn't flinch, because in my folder, tucked neatly under layers of proof, the locksmith receipt sat waiting, and when the day came it would speak louder than all their laughter combined. Soldiers don't waste breath on arguments. We let the locks, the bills, and the truth speak for us. November 15th, 2022. The pretrial hearing. I woke before dawn. The Texas sky still black. I dressed carefully. Not in a pressed uniform, but in the same dark suit I'd worn to Emily's high school graduation. The tie was slightly frayed, the shoes polished but worn. To Linda, it was proof of my irrelevance. To me, it was proof that I never needed flash to prove my worth. Mason met me outside the Travis County Courthouse. His posture was as straight as it had been 20 years earlier, though his hair had grayed like mine. He carried a slim black case, its leather worn smooth. "You ready, Colonel?" he asked quietly. "Always," I said. Soldiers don't fear courtrooms. We study them like we studied terrain. Inside, the courtroom was colder than I expected. Linda sat at the opposite table, her hair styled perfectly, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Rick lounged beside her in a tailored suit that probably cost more than his truck. He smirked the moment he saw me, then whispered something in Linda's ear that made her laugh. Too loud, too confident. When the judge entered, everyone rose. I straightened instinctively, shoulders squared, a habit I could never shed. The judge glanced at the docket, then at us. "Case of Hayes, Vothy Hayes," he said, voice neutral. Linda's attorney, a slick man in a navy pinstripe, rose first. He spoke of financial neglect, marital deprivation, and an outdated veteran clinging to scraps. His words dripped with disdain. Then Rick took the stand with a folder thick with papers. He presented invoices, contracts supposedly signed for home repairs, upgrades, services. The total $699,842. Linda Sepp's attorney spread the documents across the Judge Sepp's bench like a dealer laying out cards. Your Honor, this man left his wife with no financial support. My client has had to rely on family help, and Mr. Wallace has carried nearly $700,000 in expenses on her behalf. Linda dabbed her eye with a tissue. Crocodile tears, rehearsed and false. The judge leaned forward, brows knitted. He flipped through the invoices, his frown deepening. That sipped a significant sum, Mr. Wallace. Rick nodded eagerly. Every dime accounted for, Your Honor. I sat silent, my folder unopened. Mason leaned toward me, whispering low, Not yet, let them bury themselves. This is their overreach. Linda turned in her seat, looking at me with that same smirk she wore when she changed the locks. Poor Coulter, she said under her breath. Just loud enough for me to hear. Maybe now the court will finally see how little you Sepp provided. The words stung, but I didn't move. I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded. Mason rose calmly when it was our turn. Your Honor, he began, we acknowledge the invoices presented today. We also acknowledge the plaintiff's 6 claims. But we ask the court to allow time for our filings, already in place, to be considered before judgment is made. The judge tapped his pen against the bench, eyes narrowing. Mr. Clark, you sit here saying your client has already filed responses. Yes, Your Honor. Weeks ago. Mason Sepp's tone was sharp but respectful. All financials have been documented. Deeds, pension records, and sale agreements have been submitted under seal. We are not here today unprepared. Linda shifted in her chair, her confidence faltering for just a moment. Rick frowned, confused. The judge nodded slowly. Very well, I will review those filings. Until then, the matter remains open. We reconvene on November 29th. The gavel struck. Linda's attorney gathered his papers with a flourish. Confident he'd won the day, Rick clapped him on the back, grinning. Good work, he said loudly, making sure I could hear. But Mason leaned closer to me, his voice a low growl. Every mockery they throw, every fake invoice, every cruel word, Sepp's already logged in the Judge Sepp's ledger. Coulter, patience. You Sepp's already won. They just don't Sepps'd know it yet. We left the courtroom, the echo of heels and footsteps bouncing off marble walls. Outside, Linda caught my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. You think this is over? She hissed. You such are a nobody, Coulter? You can such even afford to keep me in the life I deserve? Rick and I have it covered. You such are finished. I looked at her hand on my arm, then at her eyes that once promised love but now burned with greed. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my arm free. You settle fine, Linda, I said softly. That old soldiers never fight battles they don't already know they settle win. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Back in the garage that night, I laid the locksmith's receipt, the Four Seasons bill, the Marriott slip, and now the court docket from November 15th in perfect alignment. 4 pieces of paper, each one a bullet waiting to fire. Emily slipped in quietly, setting her bag down. She looked at the papers, then at me. Dad. I forced a small smile. We said you're almost there, Emily. Just hold steady. She nodded, eyes fierce. I believe you. I placed my hand on hers, steady and warm. That sip's all I need. That night, as the house echoed with Linda's laughter from upstairs, I sat alone in the garage, the documents spread before me like a battle map. Each invoice Rick filed was a weapon he thought he controlled, but in truth, every forged number, every false claim was already backfiring. Because an old soldier doesn't just fight battles. He records them, he files them. And when the judge's gavel finally falls, those papers will speak louder than any mockery Linda or Rick could ever conjure. Thanksgiving was approaching, and the Hayes house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like an occupied territory. The walls still held the family photos. The furniture still bore the marks of years lived, but Linda's laughter and Rick's voice echoed through it like foreign banners planted in familiar soil. November 20th, 2022. I returned from the grocery store with a turkey tucked under my arm, out of habit more than hope. For years, Thanksgiving had been our anchor. Emily helping me mash potatoes, Linda pretending she enjoyed cooking while sipping wine. But this year I knew it would be different. When I walked in, Rick was already in the dining room, standing on a chair, stretching a tape measure across the window frame. Boxes of fabric samples cluttered the table. Velvet drapes, gold-threaded linens, materials Linda could never afford without the illusion they were building. Once these curtains go up, Rick said, grinning, this place will look like $1,000,000, and we still have the deed before Christmas. Linda clapped her hands, delighted. Imagine it, Rick. Thanksgiving dinner here, but with everything new. No more outdated soldier sips, shack. She caught sight of me in the doorway, holding the turkey. Her smile curled with contempt. Oh, Coulter, how quaint. You still think we sup are doing Thanksgiving the old way? I set the turkey down on the counter. Careful, deliberate. Tradition doesn't vanish. Because you mock it, I said quietly. Rick chuckled, stepping off the chair. Tradition doesn't pay the bills either, old man. I didn't reply. Instead, I glanced at Emily, who hovered at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale. She had heard it all, and she was filing it away, just like I was. That night, Emily slipped into the garage, her school bag slung over her shoulder. She sat beside me on the workbench, pulling out her phone. Dad, she whispered. I recorded something. She pressed play. Rick Sepp's voice filled the small space. Smug and arrogant, we set her buying the soldier Sepp's house for pennies. Once the court believes the invoices, this place is ours. Linda and I already planned the renovations. My chest tightened, but not with despair. With confirmation, proof. Emily Sipps's eyes searched mine. Will this help? I took the phone gently, my hand steady. It still do more than help. It still bury them. I copied the recording onto a flash drive and placed it in the folder with the receipts and pension slip. 5 pieces of evidence now stacked like ammunition in a rifle magazine. The days leading up to Thanksgiving were a blur of small humiliations. On November 22nd, Linda invited neighbors over for wine, parading Rick through the living room as if he were the man of the house. They admired the curtain samples, laughed at the plans for remodeling, and avoided my gaze when they left. On November 23rd, I found Rick in the garage, rifling through drawers, pretending to look for tools. Just borrowing, he said casually when I walked in. But I saw the gleam in his eye. He was searching for something he could use against me. I said nothing, just watched him walk out. Silence was my shield and patience my weapon. By November 24th, Thanksgiving Day, the house smelled of roasting turkey. My turkey, but the atmosphere was poisoned. Linda sat at the head of the table, Rick beside her, acting as if the seat was already his. Emily sat close to me, her jaw tight, her fork untouched. Linda raised her glass of wine. To family, she said sweetly, then with a sly glance at me, to new beginnings. The neighbors nodded politely. I lifted my glass too, but said nothing. Inside, I was marking time, counting days like a soldier waiting for orders. After dinner, as the guests left, I lingered in the garage. Emily joined me, slipping her hand into mine. Dad, she said softly, why don't you fight back? Why do you just let them? I looked at her, my daughter who had become my anchor. Because Emily, a soldier, doesn't set charge blindly. He waits until the enemy thinks they already won. Then he strikes where it hurts most. Her eyes shone with trust. And you will? I nodded. On November 29th, that Seps our battlefield. She squeezed my hand, silent but resolute. That night, I circled the date on my calendar in red ink. November 29th, the courtroom showdown. The house upstairs echoed with Linda's laughter, Rick's voice booming as they toasted to their imaginary victory. But in the quiet of the garage, the evidence folder sat ready, each piece a weapon more powerful than any rifle I had ever carried. I thought of the words Rick had boasted in Emily Sepp's recording. We set her buying the soldier Sepp's house for pennies. Let them measure curtains. Let them drink wine. Let them laugh. Because a soldier knows shadows always stretch longest before the dawn. November 29th, 2022. The day circled in red ink. I woke before dawn. Austin was cloaked in fog, the kind that makes the world feel hushed, like it's holding its breath. I dressed in silence, dark suit, pressed shirt, the same worn shoes, nothing flashy, nothing to flaunt. Let them think I was still the relic, the old soldier too proud to admit defeat. Emily waited by the door, her hand brushing mine. "You've got this, Dad," she whispered. I nodded, tucking the folder of evidence under my arm. Inside it, 5 pieces of proof, each sharper than any blade. Mason met me on the courthouse steps, his case in hand. He gave a quick nod. "Today sep's the day, Colonel." Inside, the Travis County Courthouse buzzed with tension. The gallery was packed. Neighbors, acquaintances, even a few strangers drawn in by rumor. They whispered as I entered, their eyes full of pity, curiosity, judgment. To them, I was the washed-up veteran fighting a losing battle against a glamorous wife and her smooth-talking brother. Linda walked in moments later, pearls gleaming, dress tailored, every step dripping with arrogance. Rick strutted beside her, flashing his expensive watch, his smirk plastered on like armor. They thrived on the spectacle. To them today was the coronation of their victory. When the bailiff called, "All rise," the room shifted. Judge Whitaker entered, a tall man with silver hair, his gaze sharp as steel. He settled behind the bench, eyes scanning the courtroom. "Case of Hayes ver Hayes," he said, voice even. Linda's attorney rose first. He painted me as a man clinging to scraps, a husband who failed to provide, a relic who had left his wife destitute. Then came Rick, lugging his folder of forged invoices. He laid them out like trophies, speaking with oily confidence. "Your Honor, these invoices total $699,842. My client, Mrs. Hayes, has been forced to rely on family support for nearly every major household expense. Mr. Hayes has contributed nothing. He hides behind his pension while his wife carries the burden." Linda dabbed at her eyes, her voice trembling just enough to seem rehearsed. "I gave him the best years of my life, Your Honor. And in return, I've been left invisible, mocked as a fool for marrying a man who couldn't set provide. All I want is fairness." The gallery murmured, heads nodding in sympathy. I sat still, hands folded, the picture of silence. "The old soldier," Rick smirked at me across the aisle. "Some men build legacies, some men just collect dust," he muttered. The words stung, but I didn't move. Discipline held me steady. Finally, Mason rose. His tone was calm, measured, every word deliberate. "Your Honor, we do not dispute that invoices have been presented. We do not dispute that the plaintiff feels wronged, but today we bring not feelings. We bring facts, and facts, Your Honor, carry more weight than fiction." He opened his case with the precision of a commander laying out a battle plan. Exhibit A. He held up the locksmith Seft's receipt. On November 8th, Mrs. Hayes ordered the locks changed on the marital home. Cost $128.76, paid in full. Signed in her hand, evidence of intimidation. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Linda shifted, her smile faltering. Exhibit B. Mason slid the crumpled Four Seasons bill onto the bench. November 1st, $2,846.19. Spa services, champagne, valet, all charged under Mrs. Hayes Sippett's name, not Mr. Hayes Sippett's pension. Whispers grew louder. The Judge Sipp's brow arched. Exhibit C. The Marriott receipt. November 3rd, $642.57. Dinner, suite, champagne. Again Mrs. Hayes Seffen's name. Again not household support. Linda Sett's face flushed crimson. Exhibit D. Mason Supp's voice grew sharper. The VA pension slips, proof of steady monthly support. Legally documented. Not scraps, not nothing. Proof. He paused, letting the weight of the papers sink in. Then he pulled out the final piece. Exhibit E. He plugged in a small speaker and pressed play. Rick Sepp's voice filled the courtroom. Unmistakable, we Sepps are buying the soldier Sepp's house for pennies. Once the court believes the invoices, this place is ours. Linda and I already planned the renovations. The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, even laughter at the audacity. The judge Sip's gavel pounded. Order! Rick's face drained of color. Linda turned on him, eyes wide with panic. But Mason wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice carrying like a command on a battlefield. And finally, Your Honor, we present the sealed financial filings submitted weeks ago. Proof that Mr. Hayes, far from destitute, co-founded a successful Austin tech startup, selling his stake in 2015 for $12.4 million. Those funds were placed in trusts and investments, entirely separate from Mrs. Hayes's access. Miss Hayes chose to live modestly, not because he lacked, but because he valued discipline over extravagance. He handed the documents to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. Judge Whitaker's eyes scanned the figures, his expression unreadable at first. Then slowly he looked up at me. To Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice resonant. You are not just an old soldier. You are a man who helped build one of Texas SEPS's most valuable startups. You have lived humbly, but you have provided more security than most families could dream of. Gasps tore through the gallery. Some clapped hands over their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Linda Sepp's face crumbled, her mask shattering in real time. She whispered, No, that Sepp's not possible. Rick sputtered. He hit it. He tricked. The judge slammed his gavel again. Silence. The only deception in this courtroom lies in these forged invoices. Mr. Wallace, you may wish to consult your own counsel. I sat perfectly still, my silence speaking louder than any outburst ever could. Across the aisle, Linda stared at me as though seeing me for the first time, not as the relic she mocked, but as the man she had underestimated, the man she had tried to erase. Mason closed his case with a soldier Sip's precision. Your Honor, they mocked him as irrelevant, but relevance isn't sept in showy cars or expensive curtains. Relevance is in integrity, patience, and proof. And today, proof has spoken. The gavel struck once more, echoing through the room like a gunshot. And in that instant the masks fell away. The courtroom still buzzed with whispers as the gavel's echo faded. Reporters scribbled, neighbors exchanged wide-eyed looks, and the gallery murmured with disbelief. But I didn't move. Soldiers don't celebrate in the middle of battle. We wait until the smoke clears. Linda did move. Her heels clattered against the tile as she stood abruptly, face pale, mask shattered. Rick tugged at her arm, whispering frantic words, but she pulled free. She needed air. She needed to escape the weight of truth pressing down on her. As the crowd spilled out into the marble hallway, I walked with Mason and Emily. The air outside the courtroom was thick with perfume, cologne, and the sour stench of humiliation clinging to Linda and Rick. Linda caught me just beyond the doors. Her hand shot out, grabbing my sleeve with surprising force. Her pearls no longer gleamed like victory. They hung heavy around her neck like shackles. Coulter, she whispered, her voice trembling. We can fix this. You don't have to do this to me. Her words echoed in the hallway, desperate and hollow. I turned, looking into the same eyes that once told me I was her safe harbor. Now they were clouded with fear, not love. Fix this? I repeated softly. You mocked me in public. You mocked me in court. You called me irrelevant. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill her mascara. I didn't mean it like that. I was angry. I felt trapped. Mason Estes' voice cut in, low but firm. Save it, Linda. The record speaks louder than your excuses. But she wasn't settled looking at him. She clutched my arm tighter, her nails biting into my sleeve. Coulter, please. We've been married almost 10 years. We can salvage this. We can forget today happened. Emily stepped forward, eyes blazing. Mom, stop. You laughed while Uncle Rick planned to steal Dad Sep's house. I heard you, I recorded it. Linda's mouth opened, then closed again. For once, she had no defense. I pulled my arm free, steady, deliberate. Linda, I said quietly. You didn't lose me today. You gave me away, piece by piece. Every time you chose greed over loyalty, mockery over respect. I didn't walk out of your life. You shoved me out. Her lips trembled. For a flicker of a second, I saw the woman I had married. Proud, beautiful, ambitious. But ambition had soured into entitlement, and pride had rotted into cruelty. Rick stormed forward, his face flushed red, sweat glistening at his temples. This isn't sept over, old man. You think one day in court changes everything? I will appeal. I find another way. Mason stepped between us, his presence like a wall. Careful, Rick. You stir not just facing Coulter anymore. You stir facing fraud charges. That recording? Those forged invoices? They stir not disappearing. You stirred better find a lawyer of your own. Rick's bravado faltered. His jaw clenched. His fists balled, but his eyes darted nervously down the hall. He knew the battlefield had shifted, and he was on the losing side. Linda sank onto a bench, shoulders shaking. For the first time she looked small, not the polished woman draped in pearls and smug smiles, but a hollow figure weighed down by choices she couldn't undo. Emily Septa's hand slipped into mine. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered. Dad, let the Septas go. You don't owe her anything more. We walked past Linda as she whispered after us, Coulter, please. Her voice cracked, echoing down the marble corridor, but it no longer carried power. It was hollow, like a shell that once held life but now rattled empty. Outside, the cold November air hit me like a cleansing wind. I inhaled deeply, the crisp air sharper than any battlefield breath. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. But I ignored them. This wasn't about headlines. This was about survival. Emily squeezed my hand tighter as we descended the courthouse steps. Mason walked beside us, his stride firm. You did it, Colonel, he said quietly. No, I replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. We did it. Evidence did it. Patience did it. Behind us, the courthouse doors swung open. I didn't turn to look, but I could hear Linda Sepp's heels striking the stone, frantic, uneven. She called out once more, her voice breaking. Coulter! But I kept walking. For years I had carried her mockery like weight in my pack. Today I finally set it down. Emily leaned against me as we reached the car. Dad, she said softly, you don't have to explain yourself anymore. Not to her, not to anyone. I always knew who you were. Her words pierced deeper than Linda's betrayal ever had. They weren't a wound, they were healing. I looked at my daughter, my anchor, my proof that loyalty still existed in a world full of lies, and I realized the war was already won. The courtroom had been the battlefield, but this moment, with her hand in mine, was the victory. As we drove away, the courthouse shrinking in the rearview mirror, Linda's figure stood frozen on the steps, pleas spilling from her lips. But the wind carried them away. They didn't reach me. They never would again. December 1st came with a pale winter sun breaking over Austin. The courthouse had been quiet for days, but inside its judgment still echoed. Papers had been filed, rulings signed, and when the dust settled, I walked away not with scraps, but with everything they tried to steal. The house was mine, not by sentiment, not by plea, but by judgment. The deed bore my name. The court ordered Linda to vacate within 30 days, and Rick faced a criminal investigation for fraud. The judge's words still rang in my ears. Mr. Hayes, this house is not just property, it is proof of your legacy. It cannot be stripped by lies. I stood in the living room that morning, staring at the scratched oak table, the faded curtains, the walls that had absorbed years of laughter and years of bitterness. They had tried to turn this home into their trophy. Now it stood as evidence of survival. Emily walked in, her steps soft on the hardwood. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling into the cool air. Dad, she said, handing me one, the lawyer called. They opened a case against Rick. Something about wire fraud. I nodded, sipping the coffee. It tasted stronger than usual, like victory brewed in ceramic. It was only a matter of time. Men like Rick always think they sip too clever to get caught, but paper doesn't lie. Numbers don't lie. She smiled faintly, sitting across from me. Neither do daughters. Her words cut through me, not like shrapnel, but like balm. I thought back to the early days of the betrayal, the crumpled Four Seasons bill, the locksmith's receipt, the whisper of irrelevant in my own house. Each piece had felt like a blade. But now, laid out in the judge's ledger, those same blades had become shields. They hadn't cut me down. They had cut away the lies. In the following days, neighbors approached me differently, no longer with pity but with something closer to respect. One man shook my hand outside the hardware store and said, "Coulter, I didn't set no. We thought, we thought you set lost everything." I looked him in the eye and answered simply, "An old soldier doesn't set lose, he waits." The news spread quickly. The trial, the revelation, the hidden wealth. Some whispered admiration, others disbelief. But the story had a life of its own now. Linda, once the queen of whispers, had become the subject of them. She avoided neighbors, her pearls traded for sunglasses that tried to hide shame. On November 30th, she sent a message through her lawyer, asking if we could resolve things quietly. Mason called me, his voice carrying a trace of humor. "She wants mercy," he said. "Mercy is not mine to give," I replied. "It belongs to the truth." Emily and I spent the following weekend restoring the house, piece by piece. We pulled Rick's curtain samples from the dining room, stacked them by the trash. We polished the scratch table, repaired the squeaky stair, oiled the hinges on the front door that Linda had tried to lock me out of. Each act of repair felt symbolic, reclaiming not just wood and paint, but memory. On December 2nd, Emily found me in the garage, staring at the folder of evidence one last time. "You're keeping them?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "They said are part of our history now, proof of what nearly destroyed us and what saved us." She sat beside me, her hand resting on my arm. "Dad," she said softly, "Mom mocked you, but I always knew who you were. Even when everyone else whispered, I never doubted." For the first time since the betrayal began, tears stung my eyes. I had never shed them in war zones, never shed them at funerals, never shed them when my father's flag was folded into my arms. But here in the quiet of my garage, my daughter's words cracked the soldier's armor. I let one tear fall, and then another, not of weakness, but of release. I whispered, "Thank you, Emily. You shall never know how much that means." She squeezed my arm. "I do know because you taught me." That night, as I walked through the halls of the house, I felt its weight differently. No longer as a battlefield scarred by betrayal, but as a fortress reclaimed. The house wasn't just wood and stone. It was the last proof of a legacy built not on greed, but on patience, discipline, and truth. Linda and Rick had tried to put a price tag on it. Curtains, invoices, false claims totaling hundreds of thousands. But the price of lies is always higher than the liars expect. And in the end, they paid it in humiliation and loss. When I climbed into bed, silence wrapped the house. Not the suffocating silence of betrayal, but the calm silence of peace. Emily Sepp's room light still glowed faintly down the hall. Mason Sepp's words echoed in my head. "They don't know the filings we Sepps already set. Hold." We had held, and we had won. December 1st, Veteran Sips Memorial Day. The sky over Austin was a hard, bright blue, flags snapping in the wind along the courthouse lawn. I stood among them quietly, hands clasped behind my back, my breath visible in the cold morning air. Around me, other veterans gathered, some in press suits, some in worn jackets like mine, all carrying invisible scars no one could see. I traced my gaze up the tall flagpole, where the stars and stripes waved strong. I thought of my father, of the folded flag that still sat in my garage. I thought of the men I'd served with who never came home. And I thought of how, even here in peace, battles never truly end. They just change battlefields. 2 weeks earlier, Linda mocked me in open court. She called me irrelevant, broke, a man who had given her nothing. Rick paraded false invoices, nearly $700,000 worth of lies. They laughed at me, in whispers and in public, believing the old soldier was finished. But soldiers don't finish when mocked. We finish when the mission is complete. I closed my eyes, remembering the sound of the judge's gavel striking on November 29th. The gasps, the whispers, the way Linda's face collapsed when Mason revealed the truth. The $12.4 million I had secured years earlier, not flaunted, not wasted, but protected. Protected like a soldier protects his unit. Protected like a father protects his daughter. Now the house was mine again. The court's ruling was final. Rick faced an investigation. Linda faced the consequences of her greed, and I faced something more valuable than revenge, peace. Emily walked beside me at the memorial that morning, her arm looped through mine. She wore a simple coat, her hair pulled back against the wind. She looked around at the veterans, then up at me. Dad, she said softly, you said not invisible, not to me, not to anyone who really knows you. Her words carried more weight than medals ever could. We stopped at the bronze plaque, etched with names. Texans who had given their lives. I placed my hand against the cold metal and whispered their memory like a prayer. In their sacrifice, I found perspective. My battle had been different, quieter, but no less about survival. Linda had tried to strip me of dignity. Rick had tried to strip me of legacy, but in the end, both only revealed their own emptiness. The price of lies is high, and they paid it. I turned to Emily. They mocked me as an old soldier, but soldiers know patience. Soldiers know silence. Soldiers know proof. She smiled faintly, eyes bright with pride. And soldiers win. We stood there together in silence, the flags cracking above us, the wind cutting sharp. For the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with mockery or betrayal. It was clean, steady, earned. Later that evening, I sat alone in the garage. The folder of evidence lay closed on the workbench, its edges worn from weeks of being opened, studied, guarded. I didn't need it anymore. The court had spoken, the truth had won, but I kept it, not as ammunition, but as memory. I looked at my father's folded flag resting in its case. I thought of how discipline was his only gift to me. Not money, not property, just the example of a man who stood when others bent. That gift had carried me through war zones, and it had carried me through betrayal. I whispered into the quiet, you didn't lose me, Linda. You gave me away. Legacy isn't stolen. It survives. The words hung in the air, soft but unshakable. Outside, the neighborhood lights twinkled with early Christmas decorations. Families gathered, laughter echoing down the streets. My house stood solid, reclaimed. Not perfect, not free of scars, but mine. Emily came in with 2 mugs of tea. She set one down beside me and leaned against the workbench. You're quiet tonight, she said. Old habit, I replied with a small smile. Silence keeps you alive on battlefields. I guess I carried it home. She nudged me gently. Well, you don't have to be silent with me. And for once, I let the silence break. I told her stories from deployment I'd never shared before, about the desert nights, the patrols, the times we waited for dawn with only patience as our shield. She listened, eyes wide, every word sinking in. When I finished, she said simply, you were never irrelevant, Dad. Not then, not now, not ever. Tears pricked at my eyes again, but I didn't hide them. Soldiers don't hide wounds once the battle is over. We heal. I looked around the garage, at the flag, the folder, the tools, and I realized something. Revenge had never been the goal. Justice was. And justice had been served. The laughter that once cut deeper than knives no longer mattered. The whispers of neighbors no longer mattered. The lock Linda changed, the curtains Rick measured, the false invoices stacked high. All of it had collapsed under the weight of truth. I had endured mockery. I had endured betrayal, and I had endured silence. But in the end, silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. And strategy won. In the weeks that followed the verdict, silence changed its shape in my life. Before, it had been heavy, the silence of humiliation, of Linda's mockery echoing in my ears, of Rick's arrogance seeping through the walls. That silence had suffocated me. But now the silence was lighter. It was the kind that follows a storm after the thunder fades, when you realize the house still stands and the roof still holds. December rolled forward with crisp mornings and sharp winds. The neighborhood glowed with Christmas lights, wreaths on doors, and children laughing in yards. For years, Linda had insisted our house stay bare. We can't decorate on a soldier's budget, she'd sneered. But this year, Emily strung a simple line of white lights across the porch. I stood beside her on the ladder, steadying it, watching the glow flicker alive. When the last bulb lit, she looked down at me and smiled. See, doesn't set take much to make it shine. I nodded. No, just honesty, just effort. Neighbors began to stop by again, but their tone had changed. No longer pitying, no longer whispering behind hands. One evening, Mr. Daniels from across the street walked over with a plate of cookies. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Coulter, I owe you an apology. We believed Linda's story. Thought you'd let the house go. Thought you had nothing left. I accepted the plate, warm with fresh baked sugar cookies, and gave him a small smile. An old soldier ship's greatest weapon isn't sept noise. It seps patience. Word of Rick's investigation spread faster than holiday gossip. The forged invoices, the recordings, the brazen arrogance, it all unraveled in public. His company contracts were questioned, his reputation shredded. By mid-December, I heard whispers that his business accounts had been frozen. Linda tried to vanish into the background. She left the neighborhood for weeks at a time, her once proud social circle reduced to shadows. When people spoke her name now, it wasn't with envy. It was with pity or contempt. Emily noticed it too. One afternoon, as we decorated the small tree in our living room, she said, "It's such strange, Dad. Mom always thought wealth and attention would make her strong, but now she has nothing. And you, with your silence, have everything." I set a star at the top of the tree and stepped back, gazing at it. That sep's the thing about lies, Emily. They shine bright for a moment, but the truth always outlasts them. She reached for an ornament, her hands steady. I said, "I'm glad you didn't set her give up. I said, "I'm glad you fought back in your way." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "I didn't set fight alone. You gave me the proof I needed. You reminded me who I was when I almost forgot." We stood there for a moment, the tree glowing softly, the house warm again. On December 15th, Mason called. His voice carried satisfaction. "Colonel, I thought you Sept like to know. Rick Sep's being indicted, forgery, fraud, attempted perjury. He Sep's looking at serious time." I let out a long breath, the weight slipping further from my chest. "And Linda?" "She settle face civil penalties," Mason replied. "But her real punishment sells, already here. She sells the image she built. She sells the image she built. She sells her mask." After the call, I walked into the garage. The folder of evidence still sat on the workbench. I picked it up, flipping through the receipts, the pension slip, the recordings. They were no longer weapons. They were relics of a war fought and won. I closed the folder and placed it beside my father's flag. Together they told a story, proof that legacies aren't inherited through wealth or pearls, but through truth, patience, and resilience. On December 20th, I attended the neighborhood holiday gathering for the first time in years. Emily urged me to go, and I relented. As we walked in, heads turned. Some people looked ashamed. Others smiled cautiously. Mrs. Carmichael, who once whispered about Linda Sipp's high life, approached me with a glass of cider. "Coulter," she said softly, "we misjudged you. Everyone did. But the way you handled yourself, you reminded us that quiet strength matters more than loud pretenses." I nodded politely, sipping the cider. The old soldier in me didn't need their validation, but the man in me, the father in me, welcomed the acknowledgement. As the evening wound down, Emily tugged my sleeve. "Dad, look." Across the street, I saw Linda's car parked in the shadows. She hadn't come inside. She sat behind the wheel, watching from a distance. For a moment, I almost felt a pang, the memory of who she once was, before greed hollowed her out. But the feeling passed quickly. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. When we returned home that night, the porch lights glowed warmly. Emily laughed as snowflakes, rare for Texas, drifted softly from the sky. She held her hands out, catching them, spinning under the faint white glow. I stood there watching her and realized something profound. Revenge wasn't about crushing Linda or Rick. It was about reclaiming what was mine. My dignity, my house, my legacy, my bond with my daughter. The weight of silence had lifted. and in its place was peace. The year turned slowly toward its end. December carried with it short days, long nights, and a chill that lingered in Austin's air. Yet inside my home, my reclaimed home, warmth had returned. The laughter that once echoed with cruelty was gone. In its place came quieter sounds, Emily's soft music drifting from her room, the hum of the old Chevy engine as I tuned it in the garage, the crackle of logs in the fireplace. For the first time in months, the house felt alive again. I often found myself standing in the doorway of the living room, just staring at the tree Emily had decorated. The white lights glowed steady, ornaments glinting gently. It wasn't extravagant, not the grand display Linda would have demanded, but it was honest. It was ours. On December 24th, Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table, wrapping the last of the presents in plain brown paper and ribbon. She looked up, her eyes thoughtful. "Dad," she said, "do you ever regret it, not showing Mom the money? Not living differently when you could have?" I leaned back in my chair, considering her question. "No," I said finally, "because the money was never the legacy. It was discipline. It was silence. It was patience. That's what I wanted to pass on. If your mother couldn't see that, then she never saw me at all." Emily tied a bow, her smile soft. "Well, I see you always have." Her words carried a weight I couldn't measure. In that moment, I realized that everything I had endured, the mockery, the betrayal, the courtroom battles, had crystallized into this, the bond between father and daughter, forged unbreakable. On December 26th, Mason stopped by. He brought a bottle of bourbon, his grin wide. "Colonel, thought we sent toast to victories." We sat in the garage, the old flag watching from its case, the folder of evidence tucked beside it. Mason poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the dim light. "You handled yourself with more patience than any man I've seen," he said. "Most would lashed out, but you let them mock, you let them laugh, and you let the truth speak when it mattered most." I raised my glass. "That's the thing about soldiers. We don't fight for applause. We fight to finish." He clinked his glass against mine. "And finish you did." That night, after Mason left, I sat alone in the garage, bourbon warming my chest. I thought about the irony that Linda and Rick had mocked me as irrelevant, when in truth I'd never been more relevant. I had built something lasting. I had preserved it, and I had passed it on to Emily. Revenge hadn't been about destruction. It had been about survival, about justice, about proving that patience is louder than noise, that silence can be stronger than words, and that legacy isn't counted in dollars flaunted, but in trust protected. On December 30th, I drove Emily to campus. She had classes to prepare for in January, books stacked high in her arms. As I hugged her goodbye, she whispered, "I said I'll make you proud, Dad." I smiled, pulling her close. "You already have." When I returned home, the house was quiet again. But it wasn't the heavy silence of betrayal. It was the kind of silence a soldier treasures, peace earned after a long campaign. I walked into the garage, running my hand across the workbench. The folder of evidence still sat there, but I realized I no longer needed to open it. Its job was done. The papers had spoken. The court had ruled. The truth had prevailed. Instead, I picked up my father's flag, tracing the folds with my fingers. His legacy had been discipline. Mine had been patience. Emily's would be truth, each generation passing something down, something no thief could steal. I whispered into the quiet, legacy beyond the battlefield. That's what survives. That night, as fireworks cracked in the distance to mark the coming new year, I stood on the porch, the cold air brushing against my face. Lights twinkled along the street, families celebrating. My own house glowed steady, its white lights firm against the night. Linda's car hadn't returned. Rick's voice no longer echoed through my walls. The enemies were gone. The ghosts had faded. What remained was mine. And in that silence I finally allowed myself to rest.